Okay, this is Karen Launchbaugh at the University of Idaho with the Rangeland Principles class. Been talking about animals. Now let's talk a little bit about feral animals, and we're going to focus especially on wild horses. So what's this term feral? Well, feral is an animal that was once domesticated, in this case like a horse or a pig or a cat, and that they've returned to live a more or less wild life. You know, they reproduce, they eat in nature, they don't need any humans to help them exist. So they live under wild conditions, and they're called feral animals. Once those animals have offspring, their offspring would also be considered feral. Three types of animals that we worry a lot about in the U.S. There's quite a few management practices related to feral pigs. Believe it or not, there's more than 9 million feral pigs in the U.S. Feral cats, over 90 million feral cats all throughout the North America, but especially a problem in Hawaii. And then we're going to talk about feral horses and burrows, which are common out in the West, and there's about 98,000 of them. Now, it's not only the U.S. that has feral animals. Those feral animal examples from across the world. Here's two interesting ones. There's feral goats in New Zealand that go around eating the range, and then there's also feral cows and bulls in Venezuela. So throughout the globe, there's all kinds of feral animals. So let's turn our attention back to the West, and let's talk a little bit about wild horses. Why are wild horses an issue? You see in that picture on the upper right, they're beautiful. They're a part of our Western heritage, but there are some issues. They have high forage needs. We'll talk about these. They're reproductively very sound, so overpopulation can occur, which leads to habitat degradation. Put those three things together and you can get a sad situation like the lower right-hand side, where the horses are in really low shape, low condition. Especially it's hard to see those young foals and young animals suffer. And then we'll talk a little bit around water sources, and then the fact that we have very few management options when it comes to wild horses. Okay, let's think a little bit more about horses. Wild horses, or all horses, are not ruminants. They're not like a cow. They don't have a rumen that has microbes in it. They actually have an enlarged cecum way deep into the digestive system, where that cecum has microbes in it, and when the horse eats grass, especially really stemmy things, those microbes will start working on it and they'll turn it into energy. But because of the way their digestive system is made, they can eat more. They can process more and pass it through more quickly than a ruminant can. So while ruminants eat 2.5% of their body weight on average, horses can easily eat from 3 to 4% of their body weight every day. In this class, we're going to talk about 3% as just an average on a yearly basis, but horses have the ability to eat significantly more than cattle, especially on lower quality food. The horses can eat a lot more of the really stemmy, low quality straw-like forage and survive on it. Again, just because of the way their digestive system is. They're also a bit smaller if you compare them to a cow. They're from about 700 to 1,000 pounds. That's what the average weight of wild horses out on the range are. And they're different than cattle or ruminants because their teeth structure is different. The cows have a big long tongue that grabs the grass and pulls it in, and then they have teeth on the bottom of their mouth and just a hard palate on the top that is able to just pull that grass out and kind of cut it off, just kind of crimp it off. Horses have teeth on the top and the bottom, which allows them to grab the grass, but they can also grab grass much closer to the ground surface. So they can graze right down to the ground surface. Another challenge with wild horse and burros is that they have very rapid population growth rates. They're very reproductively efficient, and they can double the herd size every 4 years if left unchecked and if they have a good enough nutrition. That leads to a situation where there's over 89,000 wild horse and burros on rangelands today, and the BLM estimates that to have healthy populations on the range, it should be set at about 27,000. So the number of horses we have is very high compared to what is deemed healthy for the range, and that's largely because, or partly because, they have very effective population growth rates. So where are all those wild horses? Remember that it's estimated we should have about 27,000. We have about 98,000 of them, and most of them are in Nevada. Nevada is really the kind of epicenter of wild horses and burros in the U.S. There are horses all around Nevada, but Nevada has almost half of the horses in the wild horse and burro populations. If you have too many animals on the range, just like we've been talking about in stocking rates, you can have land degradation. There's kind of a balance between having enough animals and the right number of animals on the range. So let's talk a little bit about what that high population levels of horses might mean to the range and what some solutions to that might be.
we're in the Sandwash Basin herd management area in northern Colorado. We're out conducting a gather to remove 50 wild horses from Sandwash Basin. The estimated population out in this HMA right now is just over 600 horses. The appropriate management level, or the AML, which is how many horses have been identified to be able to be out here and to be healthy, is the high end is 362. One of the main goals of the BLM and the wild horse program is that we want healthy horses on healthy rangelands. This gather is to make steps towards getting this herd in balance with the vegetation resource on this landscape. So one of the key components and one of the things that really allows us to be able to conduct this gather is we have a couple of good partners working with us. So we've worked really closely with the Sandwash Basin Advocacy Team, or SWAT, in planning this gather and conducting this gather. They're helping us ID horses that are eligible to remove, whether that's age-based or genetics. They're also helping us identify horses that should stay. So we're working with a group of professionals that know and have been around a lot of wild horses. They have a system of catching these horses that reduces the stress. We're using bait trapping during this gather, and they've done an incredible job for us. And then once we actually remove those horses, we're sending them to the Great Escape Mustang Sanctuary, or GEMS, where they can enter a training and adoption facility and find good homes. I like my job because it lets me come out here and work with some incredible people and see some incredible country. And just the wildlife, the animals, the horses themselves. That's why I get to wake up and be happy about what I do every day.
Another challenge, it's somewhat just stories, not a ton of evidence for this, but one thing that's often seen is that wild horses will exclude other animals, including wildlife, from water sources. So horses have a high water demand. They need 5 to 8 gallons of water once or twice daily. And they also are intolerant of having other animals around while they're drinking. So there's this interference competition. So feral horses have been known to exclude pronghorn, for example, from water sources. There's been other evidence that they have excluded bighorn sheep from water sources when they're there, or even that just the sheep don't like to go down when the horses are there. So there's not well confirmed, but often stated issue of horses excluding other animals from water sources. Well, where did all this start? Well, wild horses were animals that largely were led out by cattlemen and ranchers and farmers, led horses out onto the range. There were some horses that went way back to Spanish heritage and are considered the true wild horses. But back in the 40s and 50s, there was some real damage that was done to wild horses. They were rounded up. There were just terrible ways that people either caught them and killed them or just terrorized them. And there was a woman who's now known as Wild Horse Annie, but her name was Velma Johnston. She was the one that just really loved horses, and she was just distraught at the kind of damage and harassment that horses were getting. So that led to the first Wild Horse and Burro Act. So that led to the Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act of 1971. It required protection and management and control of wild free-roaming horses and burros on public land. It was put under the control of the Bureau of Land Management at that time, and at that same time they established HMAs, horse management areas. There's about 27 million acres of them across the West, and on this map there are those blue parts. So you can look at the states. There's Colorado, Oregon, but again Nevada is the epicenter. I've talked about appropriate management levels. That's what under this act was an estimate of how many wild horses could really be sustained in a really healthy way out on the range, and that was set at 26,690 animals back when this act was started and amended. What are some of the solutions? I'm going to start with slaughter. You know, many people say, hey, why don't we just gather up the horses and slaughter them? You know, horse meat is eaten by many cultures across the globe. And there would be use for horse meat in the U.S., if not for humans, for dogs, or for other protein sources. But just let's stop there. BLM has a policy of not selling or sending horses and burros to slaughter. They do not do that. And it's just not socially acceptable in the U.S. So although it might make some biological sense, it's a non-starter. So just don't go there. What about adoption? If you can't take them to slaughter, could you get them adopted out? Well, you see the graph on the right-hand side there. Since 1995, the number of horses that have gone out for adoption has really radically changed over the years. And in the last 5 years, BLM was only able to secure adoption for about 2,000 to 4,000 wild horses. So that's not enough. It's a good start. BLM spends about $3,000 per horse to get it adopted. And although that might sound expensive, it's really cost effective because it takes $46,000 per horse for the horse's lifetime to keep them in holding facilities. So the BLM works pretty hard. Probably there's ways to improve adoption, but at least it's one option, just needs to be more. Another solution would just be to have fertility control. There's a vaccine called PZP22. It blocks fertilization, and it has to be done sequentially for several years, but after about 4 treatments, it becomes a permanent fertility control. There are new fertility methods coming down the line. There's some new types of fertility control, but the BLM is really having a hard time gathering up animals and injecting them with this vaccine. Between the years 2012 and 2018, they were able to treat only a little more than 4,000 animals. That was just 4% of the population. You see a picture there of 2 people setting up to shoot a dart of this vaccine into horses, and that's maybe a little more humane than the gathers that we see in the news sometimes. What about the other solution is to get them off the range. That stops the degradation, and round them up, but then you have to put them in holding facilities. So this is kind of a dark side to this solution. In 2016, the BLM spent more than $49 million to keep horses in short-term or long-term holding facilities. And right now there's actually more horses in pasture and corrals, holding facilities, than there are out on the range. In 2019, there was almost 37,000 wild horses and burrows in pastures and 14,000 in corral facilities. Okay, wild horses are an important part of our Western heritage, but we've got to find a way to have horses that are healthy and also keep rangelands healthy. So in 2019, there was a group of people that got together and developed some legislation for the federal government to try to find a path forward for the management of horses and burrows on BLM land. And this was a really diverse group. I'm sure the conversations were quite contentious at time. They included state and county government entities, the wild horse advocates, animal rights advocates, rangeland ecology advocates, and then also the beef cattle and the ranchers all came to the table, and they said, well, let's try to find a way where we can have healthy horses and healthy land. And so they came up with 4 solutions. It's a good beginning. It was adopted in 2019, so we're just getting started on these agendas, but I think they're worth working on. One is, first, let's get animals out of those corrals. Let's try to get them off of range, out of corrals, and onto pasture facilities. And secondly, let's make sure those pasture facilities are locally run. They're by pastoralists, ranchers, where the people that understand animal husbandry, and get the money in the hands of private parties, not the government. So not make more government facilities, but put these animals in the care of people on the land for long-term humane care of them. The third is to spend some research time and energy into figuring out what are better population control strategies. I mentioned one, but there are new vaccines coming down the pike, and there's new ways to perhaps control populations. We need to spend some energy on that because that's a part of the solution. And lastly, let's do everything we can to get animals adopted out. They are important. They have many characteristics that make them good horses for riding and for recreation and work. We just got to find a way to really help get animals in the hands of people who can train them and use them. So those are just a few ideas. It's a challenge, wild horses and feral animals, and there are paths forward. We're just going to have to be creative to find those paths.